Welcome everyone, welcome Chris Kraus to Witte. First time here. I'm very happy always to welcome people that it's their first time at our institution, and certainly also to Rotterdam. And welcome everyone that is here in the audience today, for those that just crashed, for those that made an RSVP for their tickets. Thank you very much for coming to this Saturday afternoon event to Witte. My name is Sofía Hernández Chong Cuy, and I'm the director here at the institution for about a year and a half now, and I'm very happy to be here in this program that we have planned for a long time. I'm just going to briefly mention, I think that everyone knows our special guest, Chris Kraus, but I'm just going to briefly mention that she's an author of numerous novels, among them I Love Dick, which I'm sure many of you know, but also Aliens and Anorexia, and many other titles. We are here today on the occasion of the latest release of her books, which is Social Practices, which I will show you. This is Chris Kraus' latest book, and it is being sold together with a couple of other publications here today at Witte, including a very small, very beautiful interview with artist Melissa Gordon, based in Brussels, and who just gave a talk here about 2 months ago in conjunction to our exhibition around the dropout phenomenon. So maybe some of you attended that. Beside her writing, Chris Kraus has been also very renowned and very well respected for her work in semiotext, where she initiated in 1990 the editorial series called Native Agents. And we'll be talking about some of the pieces that were published there, including I'm Very Into You. There's a couple of things that I would like to say. Everyone in a chair has a question slip, so you may have noticed. And so today, everyone that has questions, please be sure to write them down. We will be collecting them at the end of the program and passing them by to Chris so that she can select some of them based on time, of course, to respond to them. So all questions will actually be written in a slip. And Jessie Koyman, who's there, if you can raise your hand, and Rosa de Graaf. Rosa de Graaf is our associate curator, and Jessie Koyman, our curator of collective learning. They'll be picking up the question cards at the end of the program and passing them up. There is going to be a wine and a beer and some coffee just after the talk, so please be welcome to join us. The books, as I said, are on site on sale, so any book that you see here inside Melly, or specifically Chris Kraus's publications, they will be just sold immediately outside. And if you want to buy one and ask Chris Kraus to sign it, I'm sure she will be happy to do so. So please purchase your books, or if you have them on, and then you can come back and hear. Finally, I want to mention that today we're doing a membership drive. So anyone that joins our membership at Witte, which is as low as €30 for a year, which includes admission free the entire year to our institution, among many other beautiful perks, you will get today, by signing up, a catalog of our current exhibition of a retrospective of Cecilia Vicuña, which is in our 3rd floor. This said, our program will run for about an hour or so, but our exhibitions are going to be open until 6 p.m. So if you haven't seen them, I highly encourage you to come upstairs. So off to the program. And maybe we can begin.
Okay.
With a quiz of freedom.
Oh, it's my turn.
Yes.
Okay.
We scripted this, eh?
And actually, because of the way the room is, I think I should stand up to read.
Sounds great.
Can I use your mic? Yeah. Thanks.
Do you want a little pedestal for the publication, or you want to hold?
No, this is fine. So I'm going to read a little bit from the beginning of this book, Social Practices. This is a short piece. I forget who I wrote it for, but it's called I know, it was a collaboration with the Mexicali artist Fernando Corona. It was a kind of graphic novel thing where I was writing the words and he was doing the pictures. So this is called The Cult of Freedom. A border isn't a metaphor. Running away from my loneliness in LA, I make a series of dental appointments with my friend, Dr. Eduardo Angeles de la Luna. Eduardo works out of 2 tiny rooms in Zona Central that he shares with a urologist. I keep coming back because of the drugs. He's willing to put me to sleep before cleaning my teeth, but also because of our friendship. During these surgeries, Irma, Eduardo's assistant, stands on a milk crate holding an IV bag of diazepam, and Eduardo plays Cuban music CDs on a boombox. His dental equipment is 30 years old. He drives an old Nissan Suru, the Mexican Sentra. Why is his life so different from mine? We're about the same age. We both grew up in cities. We have the same sense of humor. Knowing each other for over a decade makes us witnesses to each other's lives. These dental visits, like family Thanksgivings or Christmases. Waiting for the cheap ceramic caps to be made in the lab 3 blocks from his office. I sit in the park or ride colectivos around Tijuana. White pants and shoes, white plastic rosary, almost everything you can buy here, hair clips, sunscreen, sneakers, cost the same as it does in San Diego, but the brands are gray market and crummier. White cowboy hat, a quarry or oil refinery, the back of a red Ford Impala, the grave of Juan Soldado tucked away in a pantheon on a dirt hill slum halfway to Playas. I gravitate to the Centro Cultural, the Hotel Cesars, the PRD office, and Sanborns, artifacts of middle-class Mexican life, trace elements of national difference, feeling terribly masculine, exercising my freedom to drift in an androgynous manner that is after all there for the taking. Failed border crossers hawk gum and bags of oranges, but this occurs on both sides. Eduardo's colleague, the handsome root canal specialist Miguel Ortiz Palermo, lounges outside his office. Eduardo tells me he moonlights as a coyote, but is this factual? A few years ago, Eduardo came back from a trip to Mexico City and found a note from his wife. The note said, "I don't love you anymore." She'd already left with their daughters. I loan him $2,000. My escape is his prison. We meet in a bar and smoke Marlboros.
So this is one of the several works in the new book of social practice. And one of the things is that while we are launching that book today here, we actually had invited Chris Kraus to speak at Witte last year. And the invitation was in the framework of an exhibition about epistolarity in contemporary art. Maybe some of you had seen that exhibition. It took place here last fall. And it was an exhibition that gathered contemporary artworks that looked back at a correspondence and the exchange of correspondence historically from centuries back to the present day. So I Love Dick was certainly a reference for that exhibition. And it was published originally in 1997, as you may know, and then adapted to television only a couple of years back, where Catherine Hahn plays Chris Kraus. That exhibition had a production still of the television show in which, as you entered the gallery, you saw a woman lying in a bed with a number of letters, in this case written to Dick, that were hanging from a string. That was the original invitation. Chris Kraus said that she couldn't come at that time, and that she could only come over the summer of 2019, which is where we are now today. When she said that she would be here in Europe during the Book of Social Practice, I said, perfect, because we had just had at that time also scheduled a talk last year with Nato Thompson from Creative Time, and someone that has been pretty much associated with a certain type of social practice and public work from his times in Mass Mocha and also in New York at Creative Time. The position of social practice that Chris Kraus presents is one that's very different. And it's one that, besides collaboration or, say, something called civic responsibility, which is what someone like Nato Thompson advances, Chris Kraus looks at other notions of networks through affection, for example, that are associated to the very practice of working socially in the public domain. Her book is published in 2018 by Semiotext. I think that one of the things that to me was a surprise was in that correspondence with Chris Kraus at first about coming to Witte. She said it would be a dream to come to the institution because she had known the institution only from far away and based on the catalog of Paul Thek. And was anyone here in the 1990s? Okay, we have one person here, and Lynn, because this book is sold out. It's the exhibition catalog of Paul Thek's retrospective at Witte in 1995. And Lynn has brought it from her personal library because We don't even have it in stock in the storage, only a copy very well archived in our upstairs floor. But Chris Kraus knows about Witte because of this very catalog, and Poltek happens to be a character of one of her most important books called Aliens and Anorexia, published in the year 2000. So I, before launching pretty much on another piece of social practice, I wanted us to talk a little bit more about that publication. And for those that weren't here, I wasn't here in the 1990s in Poltek's exhibition. But Poltek's show, just to be very concise, gathered work from the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, and pretty much looked at aspects of both spirituality and technology and how they affected our own conception of the human body. It was an exhibition that was groundbreaking, and I'm gonna add to this that the curation of Miguel Lopez, retrospective of Cecilia Vicuña, has that characteristic as well. Groundbreaking because no one had before brought together a body of work of an artist to be able to review. Poltek had passed away in 1988, so this exhibition was produced posthumously in 1995. It traveled all over the world, and it even, in its catalog form, arrived to the hands of Chris Kraus. So before we launch into more social practice, I wanted to ask Chris to speak a little bit about the way in which her encounter with Poltek informed her book of Aliens and Anorexia. And specifically, I wanted to ask her, because that book very much deals on a number of subjects and has a number of characters, Poltek being one, and fictitiously. But I wanted to ask her about Poltek, but also about the relevance of sadness, the relevance of empathy, and the importance to her of psychoanalysis and female subjectivity that she explored in Aliens and Anorexia for the first time in a profound and articulate way.
Yeah, thanks. Can I see the book? I can't tell you how excited I was to get the first invitation to come here to Witte, because this was like a mythic institution for me. I discovered this book when I was at the Berlin Film Festival. I was like, as I write about in Aliens, I was kind of invited to the European film market, ancillary to the festival, that I didn't get invited to. And it was just unbearable at the market, so I started not showing up there, playing hooky from the market, and I went to the museum instead. Not a thing that I normally did at all in those days, but like just a place you could go for free to get out of cold. And I bought this book, and I took it back to the hotel, and it was like this whole world opened up through the book. I think it's amazing that they did this publication in conjunction with the exhibition, because, I mean, decades after the exhibition closed, this book was, for a long time, was the only thing that represented this artist's work and made it available to other generations of people. It was incredibly important. His diaries appear in here. There's a beautiful essay by Holland Cotter, who knew him well. This was just a really, really incredibly important book. So my access to Poltek was almost entirely through that book, and when I wrote about him in Aliens, there was nothing else besides this book as a resource at the time. It includes pages of his diaries, which I guess hadn't been published or known before. The diaries were incredibly touching. He had been kind of a famous artist in New York at the end of the 60s and kind of got bored and pissed off with where his career was going and what he was becoming known for, and left for Europe and started doing other kinds of work, which I guess we could describe as a social practice. He would go to these towns and villages and work with groups of other artists and create spectacles kind of in tandem with, I think, kind of pageants and festivals that still existed in these villages at the time. So he was doing that for years, and then finally he moves back at the beginning of the 80s, the worst possible moment to move back to New York. He moves back to New York, and he has no career anymore. He's not known as an artist at all. I mean, to the point where he's working in a supermarket part-time as a checkout person. And he's really depressed and in despair and kind of flirting with Catholicism. And he kept these crazy diaries during that period. And I don't know, something about the diaries really kind of penetrated me at that moment. They became really important. So in that spirit, I guess, and I very much wrote the whole book, Aliens and Anorexia, under the influence of Paul Tech's work, and also his desire to write, because he wasn't known as a writer, and he was completely disgusted with the career track and the professionalism, because he was an artist in the art world. And so he found a kind of freedom stepping outside of the art world and just writing. I only like these diaries he wrote because they're not professional, because they're so unknown. So here's a piece that I wrote about another artist who is a friend, whose work was really important to me, and who I wrote about several times over the years. Her name is Julie Becker. She died a few years ago. Luckily, her work has been, there was a beautiful show at ICA a few months ago, and it's now moved to PS1 in New York. But I was asked to write the passages for Art Forum, you know, the official obituary in Art Forum, which I did. And then a few months later, Paul O'Neill invited me to write a text for a show he was doing at Bard CCS. And so I wrote the kind of counterpiece to the Art Forum piece, which is called, of course, What I Couldn't Write. When she was 43 years old, after struggling with addiction and mental illness for many years, the artist took her own life. The repetitive picking of one's own skin, excoriation, the body's glandular reaction to a handful of hastily prescribed psychotropic meds, the use of opioids to strike a balance between numbness and pain, sometimes reaching a plateau where one can feel and even think. Unicorns and force fields, sweetness, sparkles, little dogs, and light. The storefront studio on Sunset Boulevard, where the artist also lived, was a storeroom and a lab to which domestic touches had been added over many years as it became clear that this would be her permanent domain. She'd said, "Some things in life are really harsh and troubling, and if you can find a way to be less cynical, well, all the better. Thinking, you know, can be completely suicidal. Sometimes it's better just to zone out." Whole. 2. And he realized something that in his heart he had always known, that the whole is impossible, that knowledge is the classification of fragments, and that's from Roberta Bolaño's Woes of the True Policeman. From about 2000 until her death in 2016, the artist launched herself into an unfinishable, ongoing project that she called Whole. She began constructing it in the basement of the ramshackle bank-owned bungalow where she lived for a while after finishing school at CalArts. The bungalow was perched halfway on the hill on Morton Avenue in Echo Park. The bank had given her a rent break in exchange for clearing out the unclaimed belongings of the previous occupant who died of AIDS. She knew from the beginning that Whole was built to fail. The work consisted of, among other things, a scale model of the soon-to-be-dissolved California Federal Bank building on Sunset Boulevard. She saw the building in the distance through the double window of the bungalow's living room. A tiki bar, an elevator shaft, a videotape, glitter-drenched drawings of the pyramid on the US dollar bill, and a sidewalk concrete cast. She'd said, "There's always an attempt to be whole. Everyone in the universe has spent time trying to become whole through religious means, from sitting in a church to yoga to swimming, and everybody is trying to get more energy and become more whole." But then she couldn't do it. She realized that whole could only be, quote, an endless exposing of parts and not ever reaching a whole. When asked if being whole was the same as being dead, she said, "But I haven't even had coffee yet." Founded in 1926, the California Federal Bank was absorbed by Citigroup in 2002. Its demise fell somewhere between the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and the Dodd-Frank Act in 2010. The circulation of money as capital is an end in itself, for the valorization of value takes place only within this constantly renewed movement. The movement of capital is therefore limitless. And that's Karl Marx's critique on political economy. Quote, when more than one person, that is, artist and viewer, entertains the same illusion, Mark von Schlegel wrote in Venusia, it's woven into the fabric of the real. And then again, we must content ourselves with the mystery, the absurdity, the contradictions, the hostility, but also the generosity that the environment offers us. And that's Philip K. Dick, 1974. Want. 3. The memorial for the artist was as inconclusive as her work or as anyone's life. Organized on Facebook by one of her oldest friends, it was held beside the fake lake in Echo Park during an extreme summer heat wave on a Sunday afternoon. For an hour after the appointed time, 10 or 12 of us sat around in thin wedges of shade, waiting to see who else would show up. But nobody did. And then Eve Wood, a former classmate of the artist from CalArts, recalled her striding through the long concrete gallery just past the main entrance on the first day of school, tossing Gerber daisies into the air from a bouquet. And then the artist's father, who'd studied art but worked a series of odd jobs and never pursued a gallery career, talked about their aesthetic differences as if they'd been peers. A photograph of the artist taken at her graduation from CalArts shows her smartly dressed in a black blazer and a patterned shirt, a wide, pointy collar arranged perfectly over the lapels. She's wearing sunglasses. Her long hair, parted to the side, flows neatly down her back, as if to say, she's left behind a childhood marked by constant shifts from one move-in special to the next, from Hollywood to the Valley. She's every inch the gallerina. The photo could have been taken here. You could hear in her voice how badly she wanted it. Eileen Miles wrote somewhere about hearing Patti Smith before she became known. Someday I shall write about all this in greater detail. Peter Handke concludes his elegiac essay on his mother's suicide, A Sorrow Beyond Dreams. But, of course, he did not. 4. An illusion of neutrality. Rectangular windows cut into the concrete walls looking out over the lawn. Behind it, blocking the horizon, a single line of towering trees. 5. USA. Invited to judge a nonfiction competition for a university press, she was amazed that every single manuscript was a memoir. Each featured a different recitation of American childhood. Some were told retrospectively, the authors having recently become parents themselves. Some were immigrant stories, others were gay. She wondered about this, given the range of possible topics. The United Solipsists of America, USA. 6. Schizophrenic Systems, a story from my youth. Among my old notebooks, I find one labeled Capital, notebook number 2. It's a notebook I kept during my first year in New York, which was most likely 1976, although I've lied about these dates so long in an attempt to keep my age, or rather my generational identity, ambiguous, that I'm not really sure. The notes in my Capital notebook came from a series of classes I took at the School for Marxist Education with Arthur Felderbaum, its founder-director. Newly arrived from New Zealand, where my family had emigrated, I was a Marxist. That is, I still thought that effects could be traced back to causes. Tuition was free. I wanted to meet other people. And everyone knows you're not a real Marxist until you've read Capital. The school occupied several rooms on the 3rd floor of a building in the West Village on Sheridan Square. Amiri Baraka and other political activists taught workshops, but the core of the curriculum was a close reading of all 3 volumes of Capital. Patiently, night after night, Arthur explained the mechanics of dialectical materialism to a handful of us as we sat in front of a chalkboard unfolding chairs. A barrel-chested man in his late 40s, Arthur taught Marx with fervor and discipline. Classes took place in the evenings in deference to the school's presumably working-class audience, although only a few of the students held actual jobs. I sold counterfeit subway slugs in the park. Others were collecting unemployment or SSI disability benefits. Arthur despised capitalism with the most luminous and at heart utterly reasonable form of hate. He was a born raconteur, dressed like a math teacher in button-down shirts with plastic pocket protectors. Sometimes he digressed from the complex equations of the quantitative determination of relative value, when he'd write 2c plus 2v plus 2s equals iv plus is plus iv plus 2s on the board, and with a gleam in his eye exhort, "Isn't that blindingly clear?" To tell stories of the real-life repression that were the logical consequences of the economic laws Marx just described. Arthur had just returned from demonstrating against the arrest of Assata Shakur in New Jersey. A Black Panther educator, Assata was presently being held without bail in the Clinton County Correctional Facility for Women for a murder she could not have committed. She was a slight, bookish woman in her mid-20s with a Hunter College BA, and she'd grown up in the Bronx like Arthur himself. As anguished as if they'd been siblings, Arthur told us about the police beating she'd suffered while chained to a hospital bed. And all of this is taking place in broad daylight in Clinton, New Jersey, a town which, you would not believe, is full of roses and picket fences straight out of Leave It to Beaver. Don't think the Times will report this. You've got to open your eyes. Years later, after Assata's daring escape, I'd make a pilgrimage to the women's prison in Clinton, a place that had become more vivid to me, thanks to Arthur's descriptions, than some places where I'd actually lived. Like all the most scorching hatreds, Arthur's was driven by love. It was his belief that anyone has the capacity to understand and therefore transform the world. All the keys to understanding societal function can be traced back to the means of production, he argued night after night. Labor, that is time, once congealed into commodities, becomes abstracted through the laws of exchange. C plus V plus S equals minus C plus V equals S, Arthur said, and I wrote. He never moved on from even the most difficult point until he was certain even the slowest among us had grasped it. He was a good man, a simple heart. As a young woman alone in the city, I was an open receptacle for all the projections of pain of those I encountered, and at that time, the idea of goodness moved me to tears. I held it tight in my chest like some kind of salvation. Arthur's school attracted a disproportionate number of schizophrenics, but this isn't surprising, since the analysis of systems is where they excel. 7, potentiality or rest. 8, the gallery is a place where things are held.
The invitation to Chris Kraus to speak was not only because of the I Love Dick in regards to the epistolary exhibition or her new publication of social practices, but it was also because only a couple of years ago she had published the autobiography of Kathy Acker, titled After Kathy Acker. And 2 years before that, there had been a small publication that you may have seen around there called I'm Very Into You. And I think it's important to make note of small publications, and we'll touch about it back later. I've already mentioned the Melissa Gordon pamphlet, but also it's important to know that many of the works that are compiled in social practices had other iterations that had been printed and distributed before by smaller publication houses, and that's important to take note in terms of how they circulated first, who were their primary readers, and of course the followers, the people that were affected by them. Mentioning the epistolarity exhibition and the references not only to Chris Kraus, I Love Dick, there was also this book, as I said, I'm Very Into You, which is basically the publication of semiotics, and specifically the editorial that had begun Chris Kraus in 1990, of smaller, more gender-related, in fact, titles, gender discussion-based. And this little book published the correspondence of an encounter and a kind of rapid seduction moment between Kathy Acker and Mackenzie Work. And it compiles a correspondence of a little bit shy than a year, of 1995 to 1996. The book is incredible for many different things, and I wanted to read a couple of passages and then from there take on a discussion again with Chris about it. So from page 25, has anyone read this book by any chance? No? Yeah, great. So unfortunately we don't have it here, but I'm glad to know that a couple of people have read it here. And from page 25 of the book, in fact I already have it here, in an email from Kathy Acker to Mackenzie Work on August 9 of 1995, she says, or she writes, "Emailing must be pure narcissism." From an email then of Kathy Acker to Mackenzie Work, now on August 22 of 1995, so only a couple of, shy of a week or 2 weeks later, she writes, "I love being someone's object. I love being wanted, my body wanted, and wrongly. Come here, slave. It's one of the sexiest things I know. Totally not equal to, you're a victim. Perhaps the sacred has something to do not with imminence, but with disappearance, even with rejection. What an awful thing to want the power not to die, to see that as freedom, and worse, as my freedom, as what I as a woman want. No way. I'm very good at saying what I want, though helpless at getting it, her, him. I don't like this essentialism, me as woman, but I'm using it for argument's sake." That's in an email. And to me, as I said, in that focus or that research on epistolary, one of the things that had been important for me was to think not only through I Love Dick, but also to I'm Very Into You, this email correspondence exchange, and of course the book that had just come before, just right after, which is the biography of Kathy Acker, the official biography. So I wanted to ask Chris Kraus today if she could tell us a little bit more about what it means to read the correspondence of others, not only that we read the correspondence of Kathy Acker and Mackenzie Work, for example, but of course the correspondence published in I Love Dick. And of course, what an autobiography entails, or what a biography entails. And ultimately, maybe she can tell us why Kathy Acker was special to you.
Oh. Well, it's totally delicious to read the correspondence of others. And one of the great pleasures of researching the Acker book is, and she died in 97, so this is just before the, disappearance of written correspondence. Only the last couple of years of her life, her correspondence is emailed. Everything prior to that, from the early 70s onward, was letters. And it was fascinating going to different archives. Kathy didn't keep many people's letters to her, but the recipients all kept her letters. So it was a matter of not going to her archive, but going around to all the different archives of the people that she wrote to, and reading how she would report the same event so differently to whoever she was writing to. And I mean, it's just such a kind of vivid proof of how completely relational all writing is. And the same story changes enormously depending on who you're telling it to. So, and some people actually gave me letters they'd saved for 30 years that weren't even placed in archives yet. They just carried these things around, and it was amazing to read them. I guess the other kind of interesting thing about dealing so much with the letters and the postcards was having to kind of keep reminding myself that just because it was written didn't mean that it was written in stone, It's like now there's a kind of gravitas that the written word has that at that time it didn't necessarily have at all, because, you know, it was too expensive for her to talk on the phone to her friends across country. I researched like what it cost to make long distance calls, say in the 70s, and it would be like $3 a minute, more than the minimum wage. You'd have to work for an hour to make a 1 minute long distance call. So everybody was writing all the time. So you have to really kind of read the written correspondence the same way that you would take the transcription of a phone call. You know, that is, it's not written in blood, it's just loose talk. So all of that was really fascinating. But beyond that, I mean, Kathy was really, really important. I didn't know Kathy. We weren't friends. We probably only exchanged 200 words in the entire years that we were like in the same rooms as each other. We definitely knew some of the same people. I found out doing the research we'd even slept with some of the same people I hadn't been aware of. But I felt after she died, I was just devastated by that. I was friends with Matthias Wegner, the guy who was kind of looking after her at the end of her life. And so I was kind of in the loop of her going to Tijuana and, you know, dying at this alternative cancer treatment facility, you know, which was a story that was, you know, became a lot prettier as it was retold over the years. But I was viscerally aware of how very not pretty it was at the time. Sylvain, who I was then still married to, who was an ex-partner, a lover of Kathy's, he wanted to see her, and he made 2 or 3 trips to see her when she was in a clinic in Tijuana. He would come out from New York, and I go down with him, and I didn't visit with Kathy, but I saw the setup, and I saw that really it was just Matthias and his brother Val. She was completely alone at the end of her life. And this was so shocking and devastating to me because I'd known her and known of her at the height of her fame when she would never go out alone and was always surrounded by an entourage and was on the cover of the Face and ID, and, you know, she was this icon. And so this trajectory of her life, it's this very disturbing to me. And had I written the biography then, it probably would have been that. It would have been this kind of corny American narrative, right? So thankfully, I didn't write the biography then. I found other things to do. And I only took it up later in like 2014 or 15 with the idea that I would do a more kind of scholarly thing that would be based on a critical reading of her work, you know, reading her life through the work. And it did become more biographical, but it was, as my friend Robert Dewhurst, who's writing a biography of John Wieners now, told me, everything you can tell everything about a biography by, you know, the first page. If it begins with the childhood and the parents, it's going to be a psychological biography. And I knew that I didn't want that. I mean, yes, there's kind of psychological aspects or whatever of her life that are covered, but it was about her and how she created herself as an artist. So I begin when she's 23, and she's living in New York City with her boyfriend, writing several notebooks in tandem at the same time, teaching herself how to become a writer.
It is especially interesting also that the book in its preface part begins with the question around her ashes and the funeral, and of course with the citation that, as you said, she passed away in Tijuana. I don't know if anyone knows where that is, but that's a border town with San Diego in California. So Tijuana is in Mexico, and it was already referred to in the very first piece of writing that, or that region, in the very first piece of writing that Chris just did today. And my hope is that she addresses now in this last piece of writing for this reading, again, that region. And it is a place that has changed very much, Tijuana. Many people go there because of the doctors or the clinics or the dentists. And it's much less expensive than in the United States, but also medicines are easier to get, and certainly certain treatments that are not allowed in countries are allowed there. So that Kathy Acker passed away in Tijuana is not, I mean, it's peculiar to the fact that there's many references from Chris Kraus' work that refer back to that border region. and one of them is Mexicali. And I actually got much more interested in Chris Kraus' writing precisely because of her own revaluation of the art scene in this town called Mexicali, which for me was a shit town, but that's where I grew up. And it's where I wanted to live since I was a teenager, and I left it. But I've come, of course, my family lives there, and I go there regularly. But it's Chris Kraus that has actually written about the art scene in this town called Mexicali, Baja California. So there's a very, very beautiful piece in Social Practices that not only deals with Mexicali as a site or its art scene, but that deals with the problem of social practices as it pertains to questions around civic questions, civic responsibility, community building, questions of nationhood, and what is called also radical localisms. And one of the nice things is that the piece that she's going to read, again, to speak about small publishing presses that make a mark, is she will read from Kelly Lakeshore and Other Stories. This is where it was originally published. It's a small print house from Portland that you could see later on here. We don't have it here. Ultimately, the book Social Practices already compiles the texts that are here. So if you can please introduce us to radical.
Okay,
yeah.
Sophia, thanks. Earlier this year, I co-organized the exhibition Radical Localism, Art, Video, and Culture from Pueblo Nuevo's Mexicali Rose at Artist Space in New York. Mexicali Rose was founded by the filmmaker Marco Vera in 2006, when at age 28, he returned home to Pueblo Nuevo from Echo Park, LA's hipster neighborhood. The space began as a media workshop for local kids, but since then it's grown into something much larger. A gallery, radio station, cinema club, an informal clubhouse for artists on both sides of the border. The space is open to journalists, activists, craftspeople, gang members, scholars, and neighborhood teachers. People from all over the world have passed through. Still, it continues to operate geographically and existentially from the heart of the working class border-adjacent Pueblo Nuevo barrio. Set on the Baja California desert directly across from Calexico, a small town in California's Imperial County, Mexicali is best known for its heat. For 5 months a year, temperatures climb as high as 120 degrees. The central city is a jagged collage of colonnades and arcades, sex clubs, and discount pharmacies, ringed by the northern wall that separates Mexico from the U.S. The poorest of California's 58 counties, Imperial reports employment at 30%. Nevertheless, Mexicali's population includes on any day hundreds of transient people arrived from the south who've recently failed to cross the border or are waiting a chance to cross over the wall to the U.S. Windowless, hole-in-the-wall bars stay open all night, and men in white cowboy hats stand around on the boulevards. 6 days a week, as Daniel Rosas' stunning documentary meditation El Field shows, squads of Mexican agricultural workers cross the border in darkness to ride buses that take them to work in the fields of the Imperial Valley's industrial farms. The first impression Mexicali makes on the casual visitor is, who could ever live here? Yet the city inspires a fierce loyalty from its inhabitants, who affectionately refer to themselves as cachanillas, a wild and virtually indestructible desert plant. As the Mexican writer and critic Gabriel Trujillo Munoz writes in his catalog essay, of all the border towns, Mexicali would appear to be the least inviting to settlers. What is it about this place, then, that its inhabitants find so appealing? Probably its plentiful and elemental nature, but also its cultural resources, a society of expanding horizons that curiously has yet to raise barriers against newcomers or self-impose a pedigree of entitled families to be the framers of its community. The city has a predominantly working-class history. Mexicali people do not need to believe that they're the center of the universe to compensate for what their home lacks as a city. They know what they have and what they don't. We in Mexicali like to laugh at ourselves. To be presumptuous here is a form of suicide. The Artist Space show was more than a year in the making. It included documentary photos by Rafael Vitea and Odette Barajas, paintings by Pablo Castañeda, an installation in zines by Juan Salcido, an original mural by Fernando Mendez Corona, a digital replica of Mexicali, the stunning block-long mosaic mural installed on a derelict wall in the city by a group of artists and municipal workers, and a dozen short films created in and around the Mexicali Rose Workshop. The photos of Barras and Vitea feature portraits of gang members, transients, ancient old men, and transgender performers, subjects that, if depicted by someone from outside, might seem exploitative and sleazy. But these photos are backlit by intimacy. They convey a sincere relation. These people are known to us. Banners from Julio Torres and Dino Dinko's Mexicali Rose show, Todos Somos Putas, We're All Faggots, were installed at the rear of the gallery. Several vitrines contained a selection of news clips and photos donated by Sergio Haro, the Mexicali journalist whose legendary career tracing the stories behind the stories of Baja's narco wars and political violence is chronicled in Bernardo Ruiz's film Reportero. In Spanish, the word culture connotes not just high art, but a person's entire background and knowledge. Using the terms art, video, and culture in the Mexicali Rose show title reflected the fact that the work of these artists, even those who've studied and exhibited throughout Mexico, Central America, and the U.S., is inextricably linked to the city's geography, history, and politics, and it signaled the intangible value of culture beyond any one cultural product. My first visit to Mexicali Rose was for the July 2010 opening of a group show called Pura Personaje, Characters Only, a remarkable mix of photos, paintings, and sculpture found and composed by professional and amateur artists on both sides of the border. Family portraits, strange homemade porn scavenged from empty apartments. The space had just hosted a workshop for local women in the making of alebrijes, the popular indigenous soft sculptures that create fantasy animals by crossing two different species. The opening started late and continued well into the morning. People arrived in groups. There was music and food. It felt more like a block party. I was struck by the way that some of the artists made sure to point out that although their parents might cross the border sometimes to work on the Imperial Valley farms, they were Mexican, not Chicano. We talked nonstop over beers at downtown cantinas, at the State Museum, where Vera's collaborator Israel Ortega works as a conservator, and driving around town. There was a seriousness to these proceedings, a desire to share not just information, but an experience. A great deal of my art writing work is conducted online, the airless exchange of carefully worded prompts and artist statements. But this and all the subsequent visits to Mexicali felt as reckless and eager as an undergrad road trip. What drew me to Mexicali beyond my admiration for these artists was the sense that this singular enterprise seemed like the realization of a desire, circumstantially manifested in less totalized ways, running throughout the centers of the international art world. Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship Proposal, Chris Kraus, September 2011, Kelly Lake Store, Kelly Lake, Minnesota, 2012-13. I propose to use Guggenheim Fellowship funds toward the lease purchase and operation of the now vacant Kelly Lake Country Store in this hamlet outside of Hibbing, Minnesota. Reclamation of this once functioning store will form the heart of my project. Though my involvement with the store will be finite, my intent is for it to become a self-sustaining, ongoing enterprise. As Mike Davis reports in Planet of Slums, more than half the world's population lives in world cities. This massive urbanization isn't just occurring in the global south. 82% of the US population is gathered in cities and suburbs. On any given day, 200,000 people at least live in the streets and vacant land of LA. At least 18,000 homeless are gathered within the downtown half-mile concentration of transient parks, food pantries, sidewalks, and shelters known as Skid Row. Meanwhile, since last summer, the population of Hibbing, Minnesota decreased more than 15% to 16,203 residents. Anyone driving even half a mile north or south of American interstate highways will see the collection of dying or abandoned towns between the two coasts. For the last decade, an awareness of the depopulation and dereliction of small towns and cities across the U.S. has been central to my work as a writer and art critic. As visiting critic at Westminster University's Studio Art program in London, I suggested that a group of MFA students who'd received $20,000 contingent on their agreement to undertake a group project use these funds to purchase, rehab, and occupy repossessed Detroit residential property. To the best of my knowledge, this hasn't happened, but in Kelly Lake Store, I propose to take up the challenge. Since 2009, I've rented a cabin each summer near Kelly Lake to write in seclusion. Founded in 1905 as a mining community, this village of 350 residents, some of whom live in the same houses where they were born, maintains a community historical center in what was once the Catholic Church. When I arrived, the Kelly Lake Country Store sold gas, frozen pizza, and convenience store food to residents and cyclists on the adjacent bike trail. In 2011, the store closed and hasn't reopened. Joe Terzich, the 62-year-old son of the store's original owner, still lives in the beige house next door. According to town historian Erica Larson, when Tertz owned it, he sold meat, apples, and groceries. You could go there and shop for a meal. The problem wasn't the Walmart, built 6 miles away in 1990. It was more like the new owners turned it into a 7-Eleven. They took out the ice machine and put in digital gas pumps. It used to be you'd go in and pay for your gas, and Tertz would trust you to pump what you paid for. Nobody wanted to go there for an instant cappuccino. The things you went to the store for weren't there anymore. Small local business is the lifeblood of every community. Once important informal town centers, the diners, cafes, and coffee shops across Route 169's 35-mile stretch between Hibbing and Grand Rapids have all gone out of business. Kelly Lake Store will entail the lease purchase of these vacant premises and the operation of business during the one-year fellowship period. Students from international MFA and critical art theory programs will be invited to participate, that is, work in the store on paid semester-long internships. Staffing will be augmented by local residents who, like the interns, will be paid the prevailing local wage. The business of Kelly Lake Store will be the store, selling gas, groceries, cigarettes, and other convenience store items. The store will not be used as a venue for art exhibitions or performances. Instead, interns and staff may choose to keep and or create documentations of the store's work to be exhibited later. But the project's primary goal will be to make the store's business economically viable and then transfer it to new local owners at the end of the fellowship cycle. My forthcoming novel, Summer of Hate, describes a similar enterprise undertaken in Albuquerque, New Mexico in 2005. Since 2004, the Invisible Committee, a formerly Paris-based anarchist group, has lived in the small limousine town of Tarnac, where they own and operate both the bar and the general store. Kelly Lake Store can be seen as a radical revisioning of Klaus Oldenburg and Elaine Sturtevant's Store Days installations of the 1960s, offering practical items for sale in place of papier-mâché sculpture. In these terms, Kelly Lake Store will address both a present-day need in Kelly Lake for store and a paradigm shift in the definition of artistic practice since that decade. And then I received an email Tuesday, 25th October 2011, subject Guggenheim competition. Dear Ms. Kraus, I am writing to inform you that upon further inspection of your application and supporting documents, we must withdraw your application from consideration. Support of the kind you are seeking lies outside the scope of our activities. Our fellowships are not available to assist with the purchase and operation of a store or any other type of business. Sincerely yours, the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation.
Thank you, Chris. For me, this piece is one of the strongest. I mean, every work in social practices is fantastic, but it's one of the greatest pieces for me because it really merges the practice that we all participate in the earth, which is grant writing. And in this case, it's also epistolary, but it doesn't have to do with confessions, but with dreams in another way. And I think that the combination of that with a very narrative that you tell us about Mexicali and the importance of sustainability and how community action takes place in artist-run spaces to the major part is part of that. But I want to now open the floor for any questions, and I'm going to ask Rosa and Jesse if they can collect some of the cards to see. Maybe we don't have a lot of time. I don't know if you noticed, but it's very hot in the room. Maybe on that side it's less hot. But I want to thank Chris very much for these readings. And if you haven't read the Book of Social Practices, I encourage you to do so. My suggestion is also to, of course, get the anthology, but also to be aware that there's small works like the one of Melissa Gordon that a decade from now will surely be in another anthology, as it is with Kelly Lake and other stories that we just heard. So I'm going to get some of the questions, and depending on the energy that Chris Kraus has, she can select one or two or so questions to respond.
Thank you.
Some people are writing. Good.
Okay. Well, this isn't a question. This is a manifesto. Unprofessional artist, diary of an unknown, diary as social practice, artist person, memoir as politics, reading time as resistance, radical localism, when diary becomes methodology and methodology becomes diary. Yes. Completely agree. Completely agree. There's the part that you read about time. Memoir as reading time as resistance. Yeah, that really resonates with me. I was just reading on the train ride this morning Jessica Gazelle's fantastic magazine, Girls Like Us. Her recent issue was called Economics, and Jessica did a beautiful kind of feature article where she profiled people who I guess are really kind of exiles from the art world. You couldn't even really describe their activities as art activities anymore. They're not trying to kind of pass it off as quote-unquote social practice. They're just doing things like running a grocery store or a cheese farm, or these other people reclaimed what was a hippie commune in the 70s to start a new community. And all of these efforts she describes as efforts to reclaim time in some way. So yeah, I think that's very powerful.
Jesse's bringing one more, and then here's one more.
Okay, novels, letters, biography, autobiography, criticism. How important, if important at all, is the idea of genre or are literary traditions to your work? In other words, how do you organize your books? That's a really good question. I would say the question of genre is not important to me at all. The question of literary tradition is incredibly important. For me, really, the distinction isn't whether a work is fiction or nonfiction. That seems to be there's a lot of overlap between those two supposedly separate disciplines. To me, the distinction is it a literary text or not? And to me, what makes something a literary text is the presence of the writer. If the material in some way is passing through the writer to the reader, if the writer is acting like a channel for the information. And so, yeah, I mean, not fiction, nonfiction, it's this, the novel has become this very small thing in kind of contemporary commercial fiction, but the novel used to be a much bigger thing that had room for all kinds of digressions, all kinds of, sociographic documentary information. I mean, there's Berlin Alexanderplatz, there's John Dos Passos, there's Balzac. I mean, we could go on and on. The novel is a lot of different things. So how do I organize my books? That's another good question. And I don't know, I guess I still sort of maintain somewhat the practice of a filmmaker, where I see there as being a pre-production period and a production period. That is, I'm not writing continuously. I don't feel like, there's any need for me to get up and write for 3 hours a day, every day. It's more like if I'm thinking about something, about starting something, I do a lot of reading around the subject, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, and I just kind of start to build a bubble for myself and the world of the book long before I sit down to write it. And then I get on a very strict schedule. When I feel ready to start it, then the production period begins, and then I really do need to write every day. But there's a long time of not writing, of just kind of building up an atmosphere to write from.
It's interesting of that. I was just reading this kind of, not self-help, but for sure very inspirational writer, David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times, and he was saying that he's a geographical writer. And not because he writes about different lands, but because of the discipline that he maintains for writing, so that he has this process, like you've said, and then he says, I don't write on a table, I write on the floor first, so that every paragraph has actually a chunk of articles, materials, notes, and it's all on the floor. So it's an exercise of crawling, where he's on the floor crawling, reorganizing the paragraphs based on the subjects, the arguments, and the examples of the materials, and then eventually he gets up and types. But that all first happens as a geographical, so his entire room is laid out in a, and I'm like, I think I'm a geographical writer.
That is really, that's really interesting. Instead of a cork board, the floor.
Yeah. So depending on your energy, there's many more questions here. So I don't know if you want to read them slowly and select some or none. It depends again on you.
I'm all for random.
Okay, good.
Okay, you and Semiotext have lasted and grown as publishers for 29 years. That's not true, actually. It's a lot longer. I joined Semiotext in 1990, but Sylvain started it in 1974. So, does that make it almost half a century? I think it does. It's 40-some years. What resources are most important for keeping going? If money, what other than money? Well, money has never been really that important for Semiotext because we never got into that kind of grant land thing. We've never depended on grants. Everything that Sylvain did in the beginning was completely unfundable. Really, is the National Endowment for the Arts going to fund the polysexuality issue? No one thought so. So they just went ahead and did it. And we become, we're kind of into our third generation now with Hedy Alcolti, the managing editor and co-editor. He and I work, he works on it primarily. I work with him. Sylvain works on it much less now. But Hedy kind of took it to another more contemporary and professionalized place when he joined us in 2004, where it really is self-sustaining through sales. And that means, we've addressed this question many times over the years. Do we want to try and get bigger? Do we want to hire somebody else? And Hedy's the only one. We all volunteer our time editorially. Hedy gets paid a modest full-time salary for his work as managing editor, and we pay people a la carte for their work doing proofreading and copy editing. But we've often dabbled with this question, what if we added a second full-time person? Well, it would change everything, and it would definitely change the decisions that we make editorially. Right now, we do kind of have this kind of unspoken rule that we will do money-losing projects, but we can only do 3 or 4 of them a year. So we have to choose the ones that are not going to pay pay their own way that are the most important to us. And then every year we do have to have 2 or 3 books that are going to be bigger books, you know, that are going to carry the others. So there's this kind of ecology between the books that are successful and that sell foreign rights, et cetera, and the books that circulate in a smaller and more local way. And they carry each other. And, you know, in this beautiful way, it's created this community around semiotext, so that every time there's a gathering, we were invited in 2014 to be in the Whitney Biennial, and Hetty pretty much conceived that. And people came from Europe, New York, LA. It was the biggest gathering of all the people involved, all the writers involved with semiotext over the years. And it really does feel like this extended family of writers. So yeah, it's kind of sustained itself through goodwill all these years.
Considering that here we're always writing grants, all of us, I think that that's quite inspiring.
Okay, I'm going to do these in the order that they come in. So, what should art criticism do, and for who? It's funny. My book, Where It Belongs, I wrote a really long essay about a gallery called Tiny Creatures that already didn't exist by the time I started writing it. It was this tiny little microspace that these friends of friends had started. And I gave the first reading of it at Cooper Union to the art students there, and they were really angry. Like, you know, why do you choose those people to write about? They're not serious. They didn't go to art school. And they were under the impression that, like, being an art critic is like handing out gold stars, you know, that it's some kind of selection of excellence. And of course that's not true. An art critic is just like an artist. You do what crosses your path, you do what comes your way, and what piques your interest. And there's no, you know, it follows your life. So there's no telling what that's going to be. I guess I've been doing it for a long time now, and I was like very willfully amateurish for many years until I reached a point where like that just seemed really disingenuous and false, and I had to accept the fact that I'd become somewhat of an art world professional. But I still don't I mean, there's a gazillion artists. I don't know nearly. I mean, I'm really not abreast of everything in the art world. It's, you know, parts of it are still mysterious and hazy. So the for whom question is, I guess, I don't know, for whoever cares to read it. I mean, I always try and write about art in a way that can be read by, you know, my mother could read it, any non-specialist could read it, anyone who cared to read it could read it and understand what it's about. Without dumbing it down or simplifying it, I think there is a way to talk about all of the stakes and ideas within a contemporary artwork without being hopelessly abstract. I mean, contemporary art is enormously referential, but so what? That means you can just explain the genealogy of reference within a work as you're looking at it.
That's a good response. Yeah? The for who, I do think the for who question, which is a political question in many ways, but I do believe in the politics of description, and I think that if you select someone within your immediate network, as you said, your mother or someone like that, you say, how can a person that I would like to have a conversation with about a certain work and that may or may not be versed, if you select that as a writing exercise, and that defines very much your voice and the word choices that you make and the way in which you unfold or explain things. How are we doing? Do we have more energy? Yeah? Should we go?
In your work, you seem frustrated at the limited scope of the art world. Do you see this changing? Is the increased influence of women helping to expand the art world borders? Yeah, I wouldn't say frustrated. I mean, it's more like rather than, you know, there are these people who make a career of ranting against the art world, and that's never seemed very interesting to me. I'd rather just kind of seek out the pockets that are exciting and interesting and try and shine a lot there. I mean, that's kind of what drew me to Mexicali and Tijuana. It was like, oh, this is a new romance for me. This is something that's really vitally interesting. And so I was in a position where it could be a reciprocal relationship. I was getting something from them, but I also had an access to offer, that they wouldn't otherwise have, that made it a real exchange. So yes, there definitely better representation and presence of women in the art world. But I think maybe that's kind of come at the expense. I mean, things get better on the one hand and they get worse. This kind of feminism of the cultural world is often a really neoliberal feminism. And definitely the representation of anything other than upper middle class experience is very, very, very hard to find. It was much easier to see other kinds of, working class, low middle class life reflected in poetry and art 20 years ago than it is now. I mean, the tracking of people is so incredibly rigid, and it's so hard for any but the most privileged people to follow those tracks all the way, from the right BA to the right MFA to the 5 years that it takes, like just hanging around in a city, not having a job, to be able to do your art and network and go to openings and meet curators and other artists. I mean, nobody has a job. All the younger people that I know in LA and other cities, you want to have a coffee at 2 on a Thursday afternoon? Sure. Nobody goes to work. Nobody talks about how they're living, but it's obviously not by, writing an art forum review for $200. People have other means of support. And I think that, I am frustrated by that. I think it's very exclusionary.
I think that that's one of the reasons for why there is so much, I think, dignity in the analysis of the Mexicali group. I mean, and I'm very happy that you're there writing about it. I think that leaving there, and I think that that's what many people do when they're young, is that if there is not really an opportunity in this very small working class communities, if you don't leave, the likelihood of actually being able to develop your work and not fall into the conventions of the town are very high. So I do think that going out is a way to go. There is a lot of work that one has to do to go out anywhere, but the situation has radically changed. I do think that the context right now is extremely professionalized, and then in that, which is good for many things, but it also means that if you're not part of a specific, what Luis Kamnitzer calls like a credit card history, where have you exhibited, where have you gone, like based on in that credit history, you can get a better loan, and not in a financial sense, but you get more opportunities if you follow the right track.
Exactly.
So
exactly.
It's just not
I
sustainable.
mean, you get no opportunities if you don't follow the right track.
Yeah, and so I do think that what happens in radical localisms as an essay, as it does in many of your more recent writing, is that it does present us with a forum or the words or some of the ideas to think about what is sustainability within my immediate context, and in what way can those pockets that are creative and those moments of joy could actually be amplified and be dignified, so that they're not seen as not alternative, not cosmopolitan, not relevant, or not just within a circuit, because not many of them attempt to be part of a circuit in the mainstream. And I think that that's central to your work of the last decade. For a long time, but it's just much more articulated in the last decade. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's another question. If the Chris of today were to have a conversation correspondence with the Chris from I Love Dick, what would it sound like? What is that? Be careful what you wish for.
Good response.
Yeah. I respond to your writing as a collection or a community of attitudes. Have the chosen attitudes changed? Who wrote that? could you clarify that a little bit? Have the chosen attitudes changed? Chosen by who? Oh. Well, yeah. I mean, I hope so. People's interests, you know, one thing leads to another, and your interests kind of evolve over the years, right? I mean, it'd be very, very uninteresting to follow someone who's like remained in the same range of interests as they did 20 years ago. So obviously, I mean, if you're really kind of thinking and moving, you're always moving from one, one thing leads to another, to another, to another. I mean, I think, that's the desired state that people learn to achieve as art students, right? That's the best thing that can happen if you go to MFA art program, is you get into a groove where one thing leads to another, to another, to another.
Great. Chris, thank you so much for being here. It was all worth the wait, I would say, and you're welcome to come to Witte whenever you want to speak again. I'm sure that we will have an audience for you that is attentive and that is curious to learn what you're thinking and what you're working on. And thank you all for being here. We should give an applause to Chris Kraus.
Thank you, Sofía.
Good.